process of looking at debates and things like that, we came across, and I would say miraculously, we came across a video from a convert to Catholicism. His name is Eduardo Verástegui, and he was an actor, and he had been living a very worldly life. And through the evangelization of his English teacher, he converted, and it was very obvious that his conversion was real. His life completely changed. And I remember listening to that testimony, completely captivated, like, wow, this person completely changed. He experienced the grace of God, but he's Catholic. So I hadn't heard about him before, but I was impacted by that testimony. And I think what happened through listening to that testimony, it put a really deep desire in my husband's life to prove that Catholicism was wrong. And so he began studying and listening to videos, debates. And I remember at the beginning thinking, this is going to be so easy. The Catholics are obviously wrong. And I remember I wasn't actually sitting down on the couch listening to the debates, but I was in the house and I heard what was going on, kind of not pretending like I wasn't listening, but actually listening. And I remember being disappointed so many times in the debates. I was like, wow, like the Catholics seem like they might have a point, and it seems like they actually have the stronger argument, and I couldn't believe it. To me, it was the most unthinkable thing in the world. And so Jose was listening to that, and I was listening too, and he was reading, and it was, I would say, just a little bit by a little bit, things that I believed about the Catholic Church that were wrong, they started going away. And I probably didn't even really realize it was happening. But I started with an anti-Catholicism that I didn't even know I had. And through time, and it took time, I started losing some of that.
So theologically speaking, how would you describe the image that you had about Catholicism growing up as a fundamental Baptist?
Okay, so I would say I would have thought that Catholics aren't saved. I would have thought that Catholics are on their way to hell. I just didn't think Catholics were Christians at all. And then another thing that I really misunderstood about Catholicism was the Eucharist, which is one of the central doctrines of Catholicism. I had thought that Catholicism, or that the Eucharist, was Jesus being sacrificed over and over again. I was like, that is so wrong. Jesus can't be sacrificed over and over again. There was one sacrifice, and that one sacrifice paid for my sins. And then I began, reading about it and learning that, no, it's not like that. It is one sacrifice, but just being made present in each Mass, in each consecration of the host. And that was really interesting. And also, when I read, maybe leaving my Protestant eyes behind and with my eyes open towards Catholicism, when I read John 6 with the understanding that the Eucharist is the body and the blood of Christ, it's so clear. It says in John 6 in verses 51 through 56, and part of it says, "For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him." And it's not symbolic, because his followers, they were revolted at the thought of eating flesh and drinking blood, and they turned away. It says in the same passage, they stopped following him because they took him literally. And Jesus didn't stop and say, "Oh no, and I was just speaking figuratively." No, he let them go, and he continued talking more about it. So that was really clear to me. Like, he's talking literally. Also, in 1 Corinthians 11, 27 through 30, it says, "For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment upon himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died." If the Eucharist is just a symbol, why would you die if you eat it unworthily? But if it's something like the presence, the real presence of Jesus, that makes more sense. My husband introduced me to the earliest Christians, the church fathers. And I had always assumed that the first Christians were Baptist like myself, that they had churches like my Baptist church, very similar. And when I began reading some of those the earliest Christians, we're talking 1st, 2nd century, and their writings were very Catholic, I really could not believe it. Like, I was so taken by surprise. I almost felt like, why has nobody ever talked to me about these people before? I really felt like that. How is it possible that I didn't even know of their existence? And that I was just taught all my life that, oh yeah, the first Christians are just like we are. In fact, Saint Ignatius of Antioch, he lived in the 1st century. In the letter to the Smyrnians, he wrote about the Eucharist. First of all, he wrote, "They have no regard for charity, none for the widow, the orphan, the oppressed, none for the man in prison, the hungry or the thirsty. They abstain from the Eucharist and from prayer, because they do not admit that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Savior Jesus Christ, the flesh which suffered for our sins, and which the Father in his graciousness raised from the dead." And we're not just talking about anybody, we're talking about somebody who was martyred by lions for the faith. So this man was willing to lay down his life for his Christian faith, and he's writing very clearly about the real presence in the Eucharist. And he's not the only one, but that's the example I have here with me. And not only that, if you look at the first part, it's talking about charity and caring for the orphan and widows. That sounds so Catholic to me. I began getting over some of my prejudices against the Catholic faith. I have been taught so many things that Catholics don't actually believe. I had never actually stepped foot, not even one time, in a Catholic church in my whole life. So I just believed what I had been taught all my life. And I think that's the case with a lot of people. They think the Catholics believe certain things, but the Catholics actually don't believe those things. So theologically speaking, those were definitely two of the biggest points that I struggled with. But once I started beginning to get convinced about Catholicism, that, wow, this is the church of the ages, this is the church that Christ founded, I began struggling with some other things. I began struggling to get all the information that I was learning in my head down to my heart. That was really difficult for me. I began understanding, oh, okay, that makes sense. Oh, it's in history. Oh, this makes more sense with the Bible. Wow, the Bible seems more real to me as from the perspective of a Catholic. But I did not feel an attraction at all in my heart towards the Catholic faith. Like, it just wasn't there. And we went to a retreat with the Coming Home Network in Maine. And it was the first time I had ever hung out with Catholics. So I had been learning a lot about the Catholic faith, but I didn't actually really know any Catholics. And it was probably a huge turning point in my conversion. I saw all these people. There was about 25 or 30 people there, and all of them were converts, and listening to their conversion stories. And not only that, I think what most impacted me was seeing their passion for their new Catholic faith. And I remember watching them and listening to their testimonies, talking about the difficulties of losing family and friends, and I was a little worried about that.
Jobs.
Jobs, yes. But at the same time, just beaming with joy. And I remember thinking, I want to feel like that. I don't feel like that at all towards the Catholic Church. And even in that retreat, we did adoration. It was 5 days. We did adoration every day, Mass every day, and then talks every day. It was a little bit of a culture shock for me, because I was used to my Baptist church and my hymns, and it was the culture shock to be doing adoration, and I was starting to feel a little bit of a loss of identity as a Baptist, and it was challenging. I began to realize, if I become Catholic, this is going to imply a complete change for me. and I'm going to lose my identity because I was Baptist. That was my career. That was everything about me was Baptist. So to become Catholic, what was I going to do as a Catholic?
Okay.
I began realizing the seriousness of such a conversion. My desire to feel that same love for the church began to grow. I didn't have it, but I wanted to have it. And so I considered doing perhaps the most unthinkable thing a Baptist could do. I considered to pray the Rosary, because I figured if there's one very Catholic thing I can do, it's to pray the Rosary. And the first time I did it, I really did have a very bad attitude about it. I just didn't see the point of saying the same thing 50 times. I didn't understand what the Rosary was about. I really just thought it was saying the same thing 50 times. I didn't even know it was a meditation.
You thought they were like vain repetitions,
I did.
right?
Even at that point, I still felt like that. But I thought maybe something's going to happen, or I don't know. I just did it. And I left disappointed, thinking that was a waste of time. But I had met somebody at that retreat, and she had expressed such a love for the Rosary. So I thought I would contact her and find out how she got such a love for the Rosary. And she shared with me a link, a video link. It's with Father Groschel, and it has videos of each mystery. Of course, at that point, I didn't even realize you were supposed to be meditating on mysteries. But it's walked you through the Rosary with the Passion of the Christ, the clips from the video, the movie, and she passed that to me. So I thought, okay, I'll try it one more time. We'll see how this goes. But
And I didn't know anything about it, by the way.
He didn't. He didn't. And so I decided to close myself into my room and put the video on, and it was the most beautiful thing I have ever done in my entire life. Like, I realized that the Rosary was not just repeating the same thing over and over again. I realized that the Rosary was a meditation, and like a very profound meditation on the life of Christ. I was praying the Sorrowful Mysteries the first time, and it was with Father Groschel, who's a holy man. And it just showed the videos while you pray a decade. So, for example, the first decade is the praying in the garden, and so I couldn't even say the words, honestly. I just couldn't believe how beautiful the meditation of the Rosary was. I didn't understand that it was a meditation. And God did something really powerful. I really believe it was a moment of grace in my conversion. I completely changed after that. It was a very powerful experience. And to this day, I love the Rosary. And I feel like every time you pray the Rosary, when you meditate the Rosary, not just saying it without thinking, but when you meditate on the mysteries in the Rosary, you get such peace. And a lot of times when you pray the Rosary, you get, you understand better the life of Christ. You have the joyful mysteries, the sorrowful mysteries, the luminous, the glorious. And it's just an amazing meditation on understanding better the life of Christ. And it was through that the first time in my life I ever considered the sorrow that Mary felt in seeing her son die on the cross. It had never even passed through my mind. Like, and this, I grew up in the church, in the Baptist church. And not once in my life I had ever thought about the suffering of Mary in the Passion of Christ. And it was powerful, very powerful experience. And that was the start to me loving the Catholic faith with my heart. That was definitely the start. Before that, it was all up in my head, a whole bunch of information. But after praying the Rosary is when I began understanding Catholicism with my heart. And there's a bunch of beautiful devotions in the Catholic faith that I just think are so beautiful. But definitely my favorite is the Rosary. And I would always recommend praying the Rosary. I think it's powerful. It's not just a bunch of words. It's a very powerful weapon for conversions and changes of life. I still wasn't quite ready because I was struggling a lot with the loss of identity I was going to experience. And I was thinking, what am I going to do as a Catholic? I don't know Catholics, don't know how to even behave in a Catholic church. What am I going to do? I know a whole bunch of hymns, but I can't sing those in the Baptist church. I know how to be a Sunday school teacher, but I can't do that in a Baptist church. I know how to be a Christian school teacher, but I can't do that in the Catholic church, I mean. And I really began to start feeling scared about losing who I was.
You thought that there wasn't going to be an opportunity for you to do something for God.
Yes, exactly.
You thought that you thought that it was just the priests doing everything and the laity.
I thought that was going to be the end of my service in church, I guess, and that all the things I had worked toward as a Baptist, I was going to lose everything. I really felt very strongly that was what was going to happen. And on top of that, I was really scared of losing all my friends. I didn't have Catholic friends. I didn't even know Catholics at that time.
And family.
And family, I was scared to tell my family, and that was definitely a difficult barrier to get over. But I think what helped me most of all was reading the lives of the saints. I began to realize that maybe this was a barrier I wouldn't get over quickly. I wouldn't find my place in the Catholic Church quickly. It's not something that's going to happen immediately. But I began finding hope in reading the lives of the saints, because there's saints that were mothers, saints that were teachers, and I began realizing, okay, I can be a saint in the Catholic Church and I can serve God, and maybe it won't happen right this minute, and maybe I need to learn a little bit more before I can do any of that. But it began giving me hope, and the lives of the saints were very, very important at the end of my conversion process.
Which is the most important, right? To be a saint,
right?
Which speaks of a difference in theology. Sometimes in some traditions in the Protestant world, it's about being a preacher or being a great teacher or being.
Right.
And in the Catholic faith, of course, there are preachers, there are teachers, there are, but it really, the emphasis is about being a saint, being a saint. That's like the greatest thing ever.
Yeah.
So sometimes in some traditions in the Protestant world, that is not really appreciated,
So I was my eyes were beginning to be open to all of these things, and I began for the first time really understanding the beauty of the Catholic faith, the richness of it. The Bible began to open up to me like it had never opened up to me before. It became more 3D, like the Old Testament fits more with the New Testament, and I don't have uncomfortable verses now like I had before. Before I wasn't comfortable with books like James, and now I'm not as a Catholic. And for the first time, I was able to just understand, wow, the Catholic Church is so beautiful. And I was ready. By the time that my catechism classes were over, I was ready to enter the church, and I entered the church in Easter Vigil of 2017, and it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. It was such a beautiful service. We were going to this church, it was a beautiful old German church in Kentucky with gorgeous Gregorian chants and incense. It was such a beautiful mass and candles, and it was beautiful. A great experience. And I am so happy to be Catholic, to be part of the church that has been here for 2,000 years. I can identify with a saint from the 3rd century. They believe what I believe, and it's just wonderful to be Catholic.
It is indeed. What would you say, Sharon? Perhaps there is someone listening to you who is perhaps a Baptist, Pentecostal, Methodist, any denomination, any non-Catholic denomination. What would you tell that person that perhaps is just curious about the Catholic faith, or maybe already exploring, or maybe this person has been studying, but that person still struggles with? What would you say?
I would say a few things. One is, make sure that what you're reading and studying is not just Protestant sources, because there tends to be a lot of misinformation, whether intentional or not. Sometimes it's just a passing on of information from one person to another, but read primary sources like the Church Fathers or some of the older Catholic theologians, or just to have a complete picture. And another thing I would say, especially if you're in your conversion journey, is fear of rejection is a real thing. It's definitely something I experienced, and it was a block. In fact, I know somebody who was in my catechism class that wasn't able to enter the church because of fear of his family. So it's a real thing, and I understand that it's a real thing, but it just doesn't matter. The beauty of the Catholic faith and being in Christ Church is just so much better than anything else that it's totally worth it. Just like all of those testimonies that I listened to at the Coming Home retreat, how pretty much everybody experienced some form of rejection or difficulty, but everybody was so thankful that they were Catholics. The Catholic faith is that pearl of great price. You read about it in the Bible. That is the Catholic faith, and it's more valuable than anything else, and it's totally worth it. Read the saints, pray the devotions to really fall in love. It's not just the brain. Okay, that's important. It's important to understand the Catholic doctrines, but it's also important to understand the Catholic devotions, not the Rosary. You can do different kinds of devotions. It doesn't have to be the Rosary, but
the sacramentality,
yes.
the sacramental theology. I remember a Protestant who converted to Catholicism saying that when he was a Calvinist, I think. He said that everything would take place between here and here. His faith as a Calvinist was very, very intellectual. Mm-hmm. And then he discovered the sacramentality of the Catholic faith, which involves everything, including your body.
Yeah.
And so that's
what makes it so amazing. Like, I would never have thought, things like kneeling in holy water and having a rosary in your hands, or just the touching. I remember the first time that, in fact, it was at the conference, at the retreat, that they had holy water, and I just felt so weird touching the holy water because it was so foreign to me. But the more you get used to it, and I don't know, it just seems...
The smells and bells.
It's so amazing.
The smells and bells, what you hear, what you smell, what you see, all the sacred art, all the imagery. So all of those things are really powerful witnesses of what the Christian faith is all about, right?
Yeah.
It's not only what comes to your mind. It's the incarnational aspect of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, that's my testimony in a nutshell. Of course, it took 3 years from start to finish. So obviously, I'm not telling every detail, but definitely those are the most important points.
Well, thank you for being with us.
Viva Cristo Rey.
Viva Cristo Rey. God bless you guys.
Bless you.